An Introduction to the Blue Book of the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society was founded in Indianapolis on December 9, 1958. It was chartered under the general laws of Massachusetts as a non-profit educational organization. From its inception, the Society has sought as members only men and women of good character, humane consciences, and religious ideals. For the Society is striving to set an example by dedication, integrity, and purpose, in word and deed, which our children's children may follow without hesitation. Members of the John Birch Society are of all races, colors, and creeds. They are of all social, economic, and educational levels. They are individualists who disagree among themselves about many things, but who are firmly united in devotion to those beliefs, principles, and purposes which they do hold in common. For they have voluntarily joined together to 1. Combat more effectively the evil forces which now threaten our freedom, our lives, our country, and our civilization. 2. To prevail upon their fellow citizens to start pulling out of the deepening morass of collectivism and then climb up the mountain to higher levels of individual freedom and responsibility than man has ever achieved before. And 3. To restore with brighter luster and deeper conviction the faith-inspired morality, the spiritual sense of values, and the ennobling aspirations on which Western civilization has been built. The long-range objective of the Society has been summarized as less government, more responsibility, and a better world. The organization was named for Captain John Birch, in whose life and death were depicted those noble traits and ideals which the John Birch Society seeks to preserve and to strengthen. The Blue Book of the John Birch Society outlines the nature and the frightening advance of the threats against our nation, our religion, all religion, and our civilization. It evaluates these dangers and places them in their proper perspective, against the backdrop of world history and the rise of Western civilization. It sets forth a positive philosophy and program to which men of goodwill, religious ideals, and humane traditions may rally with confidence and determination. It offers leadership which can make the dedication of such men and women more constructive and more fruitful. And it describes in detail the organization, function, and procedures of the John Birch Society. This recording was made on June 21, 1974. Note that this presentation was prepared during October and November of 1958 and delivered in early December 1958 for the first time. Not a word or copy has been changed in this presentation. Some of the references and statements are more readily understood, however, if the date when they were made is remembered. And now we are very pleased to present to you, for the reading of the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, its president and founder, Mr. Robert Welch.
Gentlemen, let me welcome you to Indianapolis. All of you, I believe, are already aware of my appreciation for your being here. I know the job it is to squeeze 2 whole days plus travel time out of your crowded schedules. For that reason, I am all the more grateful to you for doing so. It was not a favor that was asked easily or is lightly appreciated. But each of you also felt that you would not have been asked to give up everything else and come to this meeting, and then to listen to my voice off and on for so much of the 2 days, unless I had some very serious matters to put before you and proposals to discuss. Frankly, the matters are serious and the proposals far-reaching, so much so that just their presentation makes me feel solemnly humble at the size of the task envisioned. For increasingly, before tomorrow is over, I hope to have all of you feeling that you are taking part here and now in the beginning of a movement of historical importance. But long journeys start with easy steps, and our first step should be to identify our fellow travelers, no pun intended. Many of you are known to each other, but some are not. So let me, as informally as possible, introduce each one to the group. This was then done. Now I think that just a word is in order. concerning the sheer physical arrangements and prospects for the next 2 days. The possibility of just sitting in those chairs listening to my monotonous voice go on and on until tomorrow evening would frighten anybody. And while, with so much ground to cover, you are going to have to listen to me far more than I wish were the case, tiring you out or putting you to sleep is what I least want to do. So our hostess has arranged for coffee breaks in the mid-morning and in the mid-afternoon. We shall recess at least an hour for luncheon, which will be set up for us at 1 o'clock in the breakfast room. You will find that, while I shall be doing most of the talking, and doing it pretty continuously in the beginning, there will be shifts in the subject matter and in our approaches to it, which I hope will help some, and that increasingly, as I get the background covered and the general purport of the meeting begins to shape up, we'll interrupt my monologue for questions and open discussions, until, by tomorrow afternoon, I hope and believe I'll be doing less talking than anybody else in the room. Even that schedule, even with the breaks, is, I know, a rather severe prospect. But nobody in this group was selected because he would be coming to the meeting for personal pleasure, and I am sure nobody has done so. The ultimate reason that brought each man here was a sense of patriotic duty and deep concern for the future of his family and his country. So we do not offer pleasure, but we shall try to keep the carrying out of that duty during these 2 days from being any more painful than we can help. Now, if I may coin a new word, I think that the perfunctions are over, and we can start getting down to the real business of the meeting. And the first business, it seems to me, is to take a sharper and somewhat longer look at why we are here. Our immediate and most urgent anxiety, of course, is the threat of the communist conspiracy, and well it should be, for both internationally and within the United States, the communists are much further advanced and more deeply entrenched than is realized by even most of the serious students of the danger among the anti-communists. I personally have been studying the problem increasingly for about 9 years, and practically full-time for the past 3 years. And entirely without pride, but in simple thankfulness, let me point out that a lifetime of business experience should have made it easier for me to see the falsity of the economic theories on which communism is supposedly based more readily than might some scholar coming into that study from the academic cloisters. While a lifetime of interest in things academic, especially world history, should have given me an advantage over many businessmen in more readily seeing the sophistries in dialectic materialism. So I have felt, rightly or wrongly, that my grasp of communist purposes, and even of their methods, should have been more rapid than that of some of my patriotic friends who have gradually become staunch anti-communists. Yet almost every day I run into some whole new area where the communists have been penetrating and working quietly for years, until now they are in virtual control of everything that is done in that slice or corner of our national life. One illustration came to light through the publication of The Pentagon Case by Colonel Victor J. Fox, and through my getting to know its author, a retired Navy officer whose real name is Bob Winston, fairly well since it was written. The charges of treason within the Pentagon did not surprise me nor enlighten me at all. To anybody who had watched the way the administration moved heaven and earth to keep McCarthy from getting at the Army Loyalty Board, or from getting at the protectors within the Pentagon of the whole nest of traitors at Fort Monmouth, it was clear that treason, and a willingness to close one's eyes to treason, which is itself treasonous, were widespread and rampant in our high army circles. But what the book did reveal, of which I had had no knowledge before, was the huge and highly organized effort to wear down the morale of both our officers and our men in uniform through the contents of the magazines which are made most readily available for them to read. I was recently in a small audience where Bob Winston showed and went through the contents of some 10 or 12 magazines, all purchased in routine manner right in the Pentagon itself, and available, of course, in our post exchanges all over the world. When you saw the pattern, it was astounding. Through this medium, the communists have been doing and are doing an incredible job of making service in our armed forces, especially if war should come, appear as a nightmare of cheapness and horror, instead of as an opportunity to fight honorably and victoriously for one's country. And it's no wonder that Ridgway and several other officers of the highest rank, who have not gone opportunistically blind over the situation, have been complaining about the extremely low morale in our armed forces today against that of a few years ago. Other instances in every division or subdivision of our society, where the communist achievement and activity is utterly unsuspected by the American people as a whole, could be compiled so that it would take hours just to list them. We are not going to undertake any such survey here, but as background for our further discussion, I am going to ask for your patience while I make a much more general review with you of how far the international conspiracy as a whole has now gone and where we stand today. This part of my presentation is actually a speech under the title of Look at the Score, which in recent months I have been making to many different audiences. And I realize that for men as well informed as we have in this group, there will be much repetition of what you already know and comparatively little that you do not know in this survey. And yet, such a look at the score seems to me so important and so necessary as a point of departure for our whole two-day program that I hope you will all bear with me and even give careful attention while I cover the ground once more and try to draw the present battle lines on the world's ideological and political map. Section 1. Look at the score. Throughout all history, the bearer of bad news has been a most unpopular person, so I certainly am not seeking any garlands of popularity at present, for I am now spending my whole life spreading bad news every day, everywhere I can. But the man who is to me the most profound of all Americans, Ralph Waldo Emerson, once said that every mind must make its choice between truth and repose. It could not have both. Today you have left your choice somewhat in my hands, and I am not only bringing you truth instead of comfort, but truth which may shatter a lot of the comfort you already feel. For the truth I bring you is simple, incontrovertible, and deadly. It is that unless we can reverse forces which now seem inexorable in their movement, you have only a few more years before the country in which you live will become 4 separate provinces in a worldwide communist dominion ruled by police state methods from the Kremlin. The map for their division and administration is already drawn. We are living in America today in such a fool's paradise as the people of China lived in 20 years ago, as the people of Czechoslovakia lived in a dozen years ago, as the people of North Vietnam lived in 5 years ago, and as the people of Iraq lived in only yesterday. To illustrate and support this statement, I am going to ask you to look for a little while with me at some tedious and perhaps even painful history. For, as George Santayana so brilliantly pointed out, those who will learn nothing from history are condemned to repeat it. The Cold War in which we are engaged is certainly no game. It is a fatal struggle for freedom against slavery, for existence against destruction. But we can use the analogy of a game nevertheless, and I want to show you, right on the clear record about which there can be no reasonable argument, how far that game has progressed and what the score is today. To do that, we must go back to 1917, when the contest started. In that year, Lenin was able, with Trotsky and only a few hundred followers, to take the Russian Revolution out of the hands of its earlier leaders and to convert it into a communist strike for power. In 1918, they established some degree of stability and recognition for their rule by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, and by 1922, they had extended their infiltration, terror, and control enough to establish the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They were able to bring into this USSR besides the greatly reduced Russia proper left them at the time of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the further areas of Russian Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And this combination was the base from which Lenin and his successors set out, deliberately and determinedly, to conquer the world. Lenin died in 1924, but before he died, he had laid down for his followers the strategy for this conquest. It was, we should readily admit, brilliant, far-seeing, realistic, and majestically simple. It has been paraphrased and summarized as follows, quote, "First, we will take Eastern Europe. Next, the masses of Asia. Then we shall encircle that last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We shall not have to attack. It will fall like overripe fruit into our hands." Unquote. To make doubly clear what he meant and how firmly he meant it with regard to taking Asia ahead of Western Europe and then using Asia as a stepping stone and base from which to conquer Western Europe and the rest of the world, the strategy was also stated that for the communists, the road to Paris led through Peking and Calcutta. Today you can easily see how that road to Paris is leading back from Peking through Calcutta, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and Algiers. Now, gentlemen, there are many remarkable things about that three-step strategy, but the most remarkable is that the communists have never wavered from it one iota in the 35 years since it was promulgated. Through famines, which they deliberately caused in order to collectivize agriculture, through whatever industrialization they have achieved, through wars which they have cleverly and cold-bloodedly brought on and prolonged for the help of such wars in their plans, through periods of peace and prosperity elsewhere in the world, through power struggles within the Kremlin itself, through apparent changes and reversals in the party line that make non-communist heads swim in confusion, through every upheaval and opportunity, the communists have always kept their eyes unwaveringly on this strategy and on plans to carry it out. They have let nothing stand in their way and nothing divert them. They have used the philosophy of socialism as an ideological weapon in this struggle whenever they could and for whatever it was worth. But it was only one of their many weapons. They have also used bribery, lies, bluff, brutality, the countless tentacles of treason, murder on a scale never before dreamed of in the world, and every possible means to advance them on this road without the slightest concern for any moral difference in those various means. And above all, they have used patience. A patient gradualism has been the most important key to the communists' overwhelming success. The first great break for the communist conspiracy came in 1933 with our formal recognition of Stalin's regime. At that time, the Russian government was staying alive financially from week to week by methods which, in the case of individuals, would be called check-kiting. Our recognition tremendously increased their prestige and credit at home and with other nations. It saved them from financial collapse, and it enabled them greatly to increase their nests of spies and propaganda agents in this country and elsewhere in the world. Their second break came with the beginning of World War II, which was largely brought on through the worldwide diplomatic conniving of Stalin's agents for the advantage of making Russia a wartime ally of the Western nations, and for the sake of the chaos and resulting opportunities the war would provide. And anybody who doubts that statement hardly needs to study anything more than the incredible ramifications and accomplishments of just the Sorge spy ring to discover its truth. With the war once underway, Stalin was able, through the influence of his agents in foreign countries, including our own, to keep the eyes and the anger of the civilized world focused on the crimes of Hitler, while he himself was perpetrating conquest and crime continuously and successfully that far outdid even Hitler's dreams. But in this progress, Stalin always kept his aim exactly on the goals set forth by Lenin. And the tallies of his advance now began to flash on the scoreboard thick and fast. In August 1939, as a result of his temporary compact with Hitler, Stalin seized all of eastern Poland. During that same year and in 1940, through brutal conquest by force of arms, which his agents in Western countries were able to get the Western nations completely to ignore, he took over the Karelian Isthmus of Finland and swallowed up all of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It is true that most of these conquests were temporarily taken out of his hands by the Germans during the World War that immediately followed, but they reverted to him as the Germans were driven back in 1944. And although the war had supposedly been fought, in the beginning anyway, over the territorial integrity of Poland and other small nations, the communist influence among the Western Allies was so great that as early as the Teheran Conference in 1943, it was made clear that, when the fighting was over, Stalin was going to be allowed to keep everything he had stolen. He was, and a new series of conquests started immediately. The formal flaunting to the world of these conquests occurred as follows. In January 1946, Stalin's henchmen proclaimed their People's Republic in Albania. During the course of 1946, they established themselves as the government of Hungary, with brutal execution of Hungarian patriots who had resisted the Germans and now resisted the Russians. In July 1946, Stalin's hatchet man Tito completed his crushing grasp of Yugoslavia by the public shooting of Mihailovich. In November 1946, Stalin's agents took over Romania and Bulgaria. In January 1947, the mock elections in Poland formally completed the 2 years of incredibly cruel subjugation of that nation to Stalin's Lublin gang. In February 1948, Stalin's lieutenants in Czechoslovakia pulled their coup d'etat and formally placed that country behind the Iron Curtain. And in October 1950, Stalin's lackeys formalized their puppet state of East Germany. By this time, of course, there were other takeovers going on in other parts of the world, as we shall see. But we are dealing here only with Europe, and East Germany finished the job there as it had been planned by Lenin 26 years before. The communists now had Eastern Europe entire, and the first step of their three-step program was complete. Next was Asia. And there is one thing among many for which you have to give the communists credit. While they are working on a particular task, and no matter how difficult it may be, they never cease looking ahead or preparing for the tasks that are to follow. Although they were fully adjusted to the importance of taking Eastern Europe first, nevertheless they began their infiltration and work in Asia, especially in China, almost before the blood of the 1917 revolution had grown cold in the streets of Moscow. Of course, we cannot take time here to go into the ruses, plans, deceptions, betrayals, and epic cruelties by which the communists eventually were able to make their power increasingly felt in Asia. It took them a long time, not until they had the full help of our government, completely misled by communist influences, both during World War II and immediately after that war, were the communists successful in Asia, on any sizable scale, or in any formal manifestations. But these successes then came thick and fast. Here is their sequence. VJ Day was August 15, 1945. Before even that month of August was over, Stalin's troops occupied all of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, thus pointing 2 guns permanently at Japan, by our specific permission. In October 1945, Stalin's henchmen set up their People's Republic in Mongolia. In 1948, they set up their government in North Korea. In October 1948, Stalin's troops took over Manchuria. All of this time, with Moscow's help to Mao Zedong exerted primarily through its influence over our government, Mao and the Chinese communists were crushing their opposition in more and more of China. For while Mao's hordes had been given by Moscow all of the tremendous stockpiles of Japanese arms in Manchuria, our government prevented Chiang Kai-shek's troops from getting even ammunition for the guns they did have by an embargo declared by General George Marshall. Marshall even boasted that he had disarmed 39 of Chiang's divisions with a stroke of his pen, which he had. And so, by 1950, Stalin's agents had completed their conquest of the whole mainland of China. In May 1951, Moscow's invaders seized Tibet. In the summer of 1953, Moscow's agents imposed on us in Korea a truce so shameful in both the procedures of the negotiations as well as the substance of the truce as to be incredible in the light of past American history. One result was to strengthen the Kremlin's grasp and use of North Korea. In the summer of 1954, Ho Chi Minh and Zhou Enlai and other tools of the Kremlin took over the better half of Indochina. That completes the coverage of all those parts of Asia which are formal satellites today. How much further the blackout would have extended by now, but for a change in the Kremlin's method of establishing its control, there is no way of telling. But that brings us to another part of the story. For by this time, Stalin was dead. Malenkov and his associates, our subordinates, had made clear that the Kremlin was in just as firm control of worldwide communism as ever Stalin had been, and the whole conspiratorial apparatus was rapidly marching forward towards ultimate total victory. So rapidly, in fact, and so visibly, that a different kind of problem now loomed ever larger before them. That was the problem of keeping the remaining free world, and especially the American people, from becoming aware of how fast and how surely the communists were taking over the rest of the planet. For this and other highly advantageous reasons, the new regime in the Kremlin called a halt to the establishment of formal satellites and began to extend its power through so-called neutralist countries. These neutralist nations pose as independent, but the governments are, in one way or another, largely controlled by Moscow. The difference between these dependencies and true satellites, such as Czechoslovakia or East Germany or Yugoslavia, is more one of form for the sake of expediency than it is one of degree. For in either case, the people may be bitterly opposed to communism. Friends sometimes ask me how on earth I can speak of Indonesia now being within the communist bloc, when 80% of the Indonesians are devout Muslims who hate communism with every fiber of their being. But 80% of the people of Poland are devout Catholics who also hate communism with every beat of their hearts, and nobody will deny the communist status of Poland. Of course the people in Indonesia hate communism, but so do those in East Germany. And those in Indonesia are being held in line in support of communist plans and gradually brought under a communist police state rule, despite their futile and sometimes suicidal opposition, just as surely as were the people of Poland or of Hungary before them. Now I know that plenty of writers, commentators, and officials will tell you that Nehru is not a communist but a dynamic neutralist, and that Nasser is not a communist but an Arab nationalist. But the bellwethers of all such opinion molders are, by and large, the same people who insisted 20 years ago that Mao Zedong was not a communist but an agrarian reformer, and 5 years ago that Ahmed Sukarno was not a communist but was the George Washington of Indonesia. The widespread acceptance of any of these views is, in my opinion, merely more proof of the success of communist propaganda. For if you will study the life and actions of each man carefully and objectively, you will find that the evidence in support of his being a tool of the Kremlin becomes quite overwhelming. And those dependencies in Asia where the rulership already belongs de facto, in whole or in large part, to Moscow, are Indonesia, Burma, India, Ceylon, Afghanistan, Syria, probably South Vietnam, and now Iraq and Lebanon. Actually, the anti-communist position is crumbling rapidly everywhere in Asia. But let's consider just those countries we have named. When these are added to the actual satellites, China, North Korea, North Vietnam, and all of Russia in Asia, and if you will look at a map of Asia with all of these countries properly shaded, I think you will agree with me in my estimate of the Communists' progress. It is that they have already gone 3/4 of the way towards the completion of the second step in their three-part program. Now let's consider the rest of the world. And again we find that the Communists, while working hard at the immediate task of getting control of the masses of Asia, and of making Fortress Asia the stepping stone for conquering the rest of the world, have also been looking ahead and doing everything possible, everything that was also strategically wise, to make their final undertaking both easier and more certain of success. It is interesting, for instance, and also frightening, to note how far the Communists have already gone in their encirclement of Western Europe, although their movement back across Asia from Peking towards Paris has only recently reached the Mediterranean. Their treatment of Northern Africa as geographically and ethnically an extension, for their purposes, of the Asian mass and masses is only a part of the story. As you will see, again by marking up a map, this encirclement of Western Europe begins with Russia itself and its immediate satellites on the north and east. Then as you move around the Asiatic side of the Mediterranean, you have Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, in all of which the Communists either already have control, however disguised, or are rapidly acquiring control. Jumping across Spain and the British Isles to the northwest, there is Iceland. Then, completing the circle, Norway and now Finland. And gentlemen, any idea that Norway is not, for all practical purposes, now in Communist hands, or that Iceland and Finland are not completely so, is in my opinion as unrealistic as the thought that Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana is a Democrat. This doesn't mean that the Communists intend to have troops march in from this periphery and take Western Europe by force. They don't have to. It does mean that the pressures and threats they can exert on the chancelleries of Western Europe from this encirclement, the aid they can give to their agents in the governments and national activities of every kind in Western Europe, and the weakening of the remaining anti-communist strength in Western Europe through this encirclement without, added to infiltration within, that this overall communist progress has made the position of Western Europe very precarious indeed. It certainly makes plausible the contention of one of our best-informed writers for our magazine, himself a European, that the Communists will be able to take Western Europe by telephone within the next 2 or 3 more years if they consider it strategically wise to do so. Coming to the Western Hemisphere, you now have Dr. J. Gann, an avowed communist, ruling British Guiana. If any real anti-communist were elected president of Panama, he would undoubtedly be assassinated, as Ramon was some 4 years ago. Incidentally, assassination of heads of state is now becoming quite a normal and regular part of the technique of communist advance in Latin America. Within the past few years, there have been assassinations of Ramon of Panama, President Somoza of Nicaragua, President Castillo Ramos of Guatemala, and before that of Colonel Aranda of Guatemala, presidential candidate who had been murdered in Mexico to enable Arbenz Guzman to take over. The Communists are now in complete control of Bolivia and Venezuela. They expect to have Guatemala back in the Communist camp in short order. And Romulo Betancourt of Venezuela, who says he is not a communist, but has admitted he was a Marxist, and who has spent his whole career in helping the Communists, seems to be taking the lead in plots and plans to overthrow the very few remaining really anti-communist governments in Latin America. They are Cuba, Paraguay, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic. Right now he is giving powerful help, probably the most powerful next to that of our government, towards the overthrow of Batista in Cuba by the communist Fidel Castro, and the establishment of a communist beachhead 90 miles from our shores. And gentlemen, if you have any slightest doubt that Castro is a communist, don't. If he is successful, time will clearly reveal that he is an agent of the Kremlin. On the other side of the hemisphere, we have Hawaii. And for the truth about the present communist control of the Hawaiian Islands, just ask any member, Republican or Democrat, of the Senate subcommittee which spent considerable time on the islands investigating the situation in the fall of 1956. Or ask any member of the leading families there, the Cooks, Bishops, Judds, Castles, or others whom you may happen to know. 5 years ago, these people were all for Hawaiian statehood. For the last 2 years, many of them have been vigorously opposing Hawaiian statehood for the near future by every means at their disposal, for they have feared that Hawaii as a state would send 2 communists or pro-communists picked by Harry Bridges to the United States Senate, and that the whole state government would be communist-controlled. As any of the leading citizens will tell you, and as the Senate subcommittee stated in plain language, the communist stranglehold on the economic life of Hawaii is now so great that it constitutes virtual political control as well. When you then finally come to the extent of communist infiltration and influence right inside our own continental borders, the subject is entirely too large for us to do more than indicate a few pointers. But for a first danger sign, the unions which control our shipping and many vital parts of our economy are communist-ruled or communist-dominated. Just for one instance, 75 vital links in the most secret communications of our government itself, including those of the Pentagon to Air Force bases in New York, Maine, England, Canada, and Newfoundland, are all available to the members of one union, the American Communications Association, which was kicked out of the CIO in 1950 as being too communist even for that outfit. In May 1957, the president of this union and 5 other officials and members invoked the Fifth Amendment when questioned about Communist Party membership. Yet the members of this union are still in position to put their hands on any and all messages over these 75 links in our government's own communications system. Now, the real significance of what I have just said lies in the fact that this door of betrayal is known to be wide open, and nobody in Congress, in the executive branch, in the Pentagon itself, nobody even dares to try to close it. That is one indication of how powerful the communist influence has now become in almost all of our federal agencies. A 25-year career man in our State Department resigned 3 years ago to tell the American people in his book, Inside the State Department, of the treasonous falsifications of information concerning our foreign affairs which is going on there all of the time. And the communist influence over our mass media of communication, press, radio, television, is so great that you probably never even heard of his book. Friends sometimes say to me, quote, "Look, even in easygoing America there must still be a few Arnold von Winkelrieds left, men who are willing to gather all of the enemy's spears they can reach into their own bodies so that their compatriots can break through the hostile phalanx. If things are as bad in our government as you say they are, you'd think there would be some patriot inside who would be willing to give up his career, sacrifice everything if need be, and tell the American people the truth." Unquote. The answer is, of course, that there are many men who do this, one after another. Arthur Bliss Lane, one of our greatest, most experienced, and most honored diplomats, resigned from the service in order to write, "I Saw Poland Betrayed." This was no second-hand story told by some hack journalist dealing in sensationalism. This was the factual recital by an American ambassador, giving out of his own personal knowledge the names, dates, places, and events of the deliberate and treasonous betrayal of Poland by our government into Soviet hands. These were things he had seen with his own eyes and events in which he had been forced to acquiesce, while actually serving as our ambassador to the very country being betrayed. His book, for which he gave up so much, should have shocked the American people into a fury of resentment against the Atchison-infested State Department and the whole Truman administration. But it didn't create even a ripple. It sold a few thousand copies. Then no more were available. For reasons never made entirely clear, the publishers declined to bring out a new edition. Most of the copies which had gone to libraries were gradually removed by communists or communist sympathizers and became, quote, lost, unquote. If you want an interesting exercise today, just see how long it will take any of the best second-hand book dealers in America to find you a copy, and at what cost. Dr. Medford Evans was the Chief of Security Training for our whole Atomic Energy Commission and all of its plants. It was by far the best job he had ever had. In due course, he discovered how blatant and widespread were the treasonous activities throughout the whole operation. In another while, he discovered how easily and successfully all efforts on his part to improve security measures were ignored or circumvented by the traitors. With a family to support and no money, Dr. Evans gave up his job in order to tell the American people the truth in his book, The Secret War for the A-Bomb. He made clear that, despite the A-bombs which the Soviets had been exploding for show-off purposes, and to increase their prestige and diplomatic pressures, they had not yet built one. Their agents had simply walked off from our plants with the necessary separate parts, which had then been assembled in Russia and exploded whenever it best suited the Soviets' pretenses. Here again we had an able and respected American writing at great cost to himself of things he knew from his own personal observation, contacts, and experience. The book dealt with a matter of literally vital importance to the safety of our country. It told of treason at work beyond any conception of the American people. It should have rocked the nation from one end to the other. Instead, it sold 2,600 copies. There is no clearer proof of the effectiveness of the blanket of obfuscation with which communist influences have been able to keep the truth about their activities from being known. But to go on with other pointers, the best informed authorities say that there are at least 30 huge communist espionage rings operating in this country today against the only 2 or 3 that have been only partly exposed. Not only has all really effective exposure of these espionage rings and agents now been stopped, but scores of known communist sympathizers have been restored by Supreme Court rulings to their former jobs within our federal government. Communist sympathies and even actual communist subversion are daily made more respectable by the actions of our government, our great universities, much of our press, and by the complacency of our people. And I could go on with specific factual illustrations and instances of this spreading, deepening communist influence for hours, as I do in other speeches, if this were the occasion. It is not. So let me come to the point, which is an appraisal of the communists' progress towards the completion of their third step. Before doing so, however, I should like to make clear in my own defense that my credentials for the task are not based simply on my association with other anti-communists. It's true that I have been to Formosa and talked with Chiang Kai-shek and to practically every high official in the Chinese nationalist government, with some of them at considerable length. I have been to West Germany and talked with Chancellor Adenauer. I have been in personal association or voluminous correspondence with many, if not most, of the leading anti-communists in this country and throughout the world. And I have diligently studied the anti-communist books and objective histories which reveal piecemeal the horrifying truth of the past 2 decades. None of that, however, constitutes the best support of my right to express the opinion I am going to give you. That right comes primarily from a study of the communists' own periodicals and current literature. I read the Daily Worker faithfully until they suspended its publication. I now read their best-known weekly in America, the National Guardian, far more regularly than I ever read the Saturday Evening Post. I subscribe to and keep up fairly well with their monthlies, Political Affairs and the New World Review. I take 3 or 4 communist publications from other countries, and friends are constantly sending me tear sheets and articles out of others from all over the world. And it is in the communists' own publications that you not only read their lies and find the full measure of their malice and their nastiness, that is where you also learn what they consider important in all they have done in the past or expect to do in the future. They lay out the line for their own people, confident of sufficient control over all mass media of communication in America to ensure that that line reaches the American people, including the great mass of newspaper readers, only in such parts, in such ways, and at such times as the Communist Party desires. And it is to this presentation by the Communists themselves, especially in their periodicals, that the serious student of the conspiracy goes to learn of their progress and their plans. It is with the benefit of this realistic background, therefore, that I venture to offer the following opinion. It is certainly an honest opinion, concurred in by all of the well-informed anti-communists I know. It is that the communists, through long and careful and insidious preparation, have already gone at least 1/4 of the way towards the accomplishment of their third and final step, which is taking over this country, and with it, of course, the rest of the world. The simple arithmetic of the situation, therefore, is as follows. Call each of the 3 steps 1, and their total 3. The communists have accomplished all of the first step, Eastern Europe, plus 3/4 of the second, the masses of Asia, plus 1/4 of the third. 1 plus 3/4 plus 1/4 adds up to 2 out of that total of 3. And not to believe that the communists are already 2/3 of the way towards carrying out their total program, or that they are not now moving at an accelerated pace and with an increased momentum to finish the job, is to close your eyes to the plain facts as surely as did the good people of Czechoslovakia in 1948, and with the same, ultimately, fatal results. Now let's just look very briefly at a different kind of scoreboard measuring the same communist advance. At the last get-together of international communism before World War II, the communist parties represented had a total membership figure of slightly more than 4 million members. But in November 1957, at the triumphant meeting in Moscow to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the success of the Bolshevik Revolution, 75 communist parties could be officially counted with a total membership of 33 million. This is approximately an 800% increase in the 20 years, and that is just about the rate of growth of communist power throughout the world in that time, no matter how you look at it. Or let's study quickly still one more and final scoreboard, perhaps the most revealing and frightening of them all. Here it is. Since August 1945, the communists have averaged taking over 7,000 newly enslaved subjects every hour. And please remember that these people, whether in Indonesia or Iraq or Korea, have the same love for their families, think of concentration camps with the same despairing horror, and feel the same pain under torture as do you and I. Let me repeat that. Several thousand more human beings, just like you and me, have been brought under the incredibly brutal rule of the communist police state every hour, 24 hours of every day, 365 days of every year, for the past 13 years. And not only is that process not being interrupted in any way, today the rate of conquest and enslavement is actually increasing, as the 80 million people of Indonesia would gladly testify, for the darkness of police state rule is closing over them very fast. Now please note, gentlemen, that the communists have never made any of this immense progress by the direct use of force. They have beguiled Chinese into fighting Chinese, Koreans into fighting Koreans, Vietnamese into fighting the French and each other, the Israelis, British, and French into fighting Egyptians, and the Algerians into fighting the French. They have even maneuvered Americans into fighting Chinese communists in Korea with the Americans' hands tied behind their backs. But not one Russian regiment has ever taken part in any of this imperialistic advance, except in the suppression of rebellion in already conquered territory, as in Hungary. the communists have put over these tremendous gains by bluff and bluster, lies and deception, murder, and, above all, by treason within other governments, and by diplomatic pressures based on all of these other means. And that lamp of experience certainly should guide us as to what they are up to today. There are three possible methods by which the communists might take us over. One would be through a sufficient amount of infiltration and propaganda to disguise communism as just another political party, and thus to get enough communist agents and sympathizers into positions of power in our government to enable them to seize formal power by a peaceful coup d'etat, as they did in Czechoslovakia in February 1948. We do not anticipate that development. The second method would be by fomenting internal civil war in this country and aiding the communist side in that war with all necessary military might. This is, of course, the method they used in China. But in the long struggle in China, the Kremlin was handicapped by the need for keeping its own intervention from being accurately understood and appraised by other nations. By the time the Soviet rulers ever came to apply this plan to our country, there obviously would be no compelling reason for them to hold back in any way. And it seems clear from all of their past history, as well as from the nature of the beast, that despite their vaunted missiles and bombs, the Soviets would not attempt military conquest of so powerful and so extensive a country as the United States without availing themselves of a sufficiently strong fifth column in our midst. A fifth column which could provide the sabotage, the false leadership, and the sudden seizures of power and of means of communication needed to convert the struggle from the very beginning into a civil war rather than clear-cut war with an external enemy. The horror and cruelty which would be made possible by such planned confusion is something to contemplate. And, as we said in the first issue of our magazine, American Opinion, we can foresee a possibility of the Kremlin taking this gamble in time. In fact, it is clear that the communists long ago made plans to have this method available, in whole or in part, to whatever extent it might be useful. The trouble in our southern states has been fomented almost entirely by the communists for this purpose. It has been their plan, gradually carried out over a long period with meticulous cunning, to stir up such bitterness between whites and blacks in the South that small flames of civil disorder would inevitably result. They could then fan and coalesce these little flames into one great conflagration of civil war in time if the need arose. The whole slogan of, quote, civil rights, unquote, as used to make trouble in the South today, is an exact parallel to the slogan of, quote, agrarian reform, unquote, which they used in China. And the communists, who are pulling innocent and idealistic Americans into promoting this agitation for them, have no more real interest in the welfare of the Negroes and no more concern about the damage they actually do to our colored population than the Chinese communists had with regard to the welfare of the Chinese peasants. But there is a third method, which is far more in accordance with Lenin's long-range strategy. It is one which they are clearly relying on most heavily, and this is taking us over by a process so gradual and insidious that Soviet rule is slipped over so far on the American people before they ever realize it is happening that they can no longer resist the communist conspiracy as free citizens, but can resist the communist tyranny only by themselves becoming conspirators against established government. The process in that direction is going on right now, gradually but surely, and with ever-increasing spread and speed. A part of that plan, of course, is to induce the gradual surrender of American sovereignty, piece by piece and step by step, to various international organizations, of which the United Nations is the outstanding but far from the only example, while the communists are simultaneously and equally gradually getting complete working control of such organizations. Both sets of steps, which were short and insidious at first, are now being steadily increased in both length and brazenness, until one day we shall gradually realize that we are already just a part of a worldwide government ruled by the Kremlin, with the police state features of that government rapidly closing in on ourselves. But another part of that plan is the conversion of the United States into a socialist nation, quite similar to Russia itself in its economy and political outlook, before police state enforcement is ever introduced. The best way to explain the aim here is simply to quote the directive, under which some of the very largest American foundations have been secretly but visibly working for years. This directive is, quote, "so to change the economic and political structure of the United States that it can be comfortably merged with Soviet Russia," unquote. These foundations, influential as they are, nevertheless are comparatively just a very small part of the tremendous forces at work in America today to accomplish this aim. And these total forces, marvelously organized and brilliantly directed, use 100 to 1,000 completely misguided Americans who are not communists for every actual communist who is pulling strings behind the scenes to help them to put over their innocent and even, quote, progressive, unquote, sounding plans. For the West, gentlemen, is suffering under many delusions. One is that our enemy is an ideology. It is not. Communism is not a political party, nor a military organization, nor an ideological crusade, nor a rebirth of Russian imperialist ambition, though it comprises and uses all of these parts and pretenses. Communism, in its unmistakable present reality, is wholly a conspiracy, a gigantic conspiracy to enslave mankind, an increasingly successful conspiracy controlled by determined, cunning, and utterly ruthless gangsters willing to use any means to achieve its end. One means, of course, is to make socialism sound appealing, and above all, to make it seem inevitable. This operation of giving an appearance of spontaneity to a movement to the left which is conspiratorially plotted and promoted is so large that we could not possibly outline it here. Let's merely look at one of the more spectacular means the communists designed for this promotion, namely Sputnik, and let you project the whole wheel from that one spoke. I can't tell you how large a part of their military budget the Russians put into a crash program to get a Sputnik into the sky, after goodness knows how many failures, by October 1957. I can't tell you how communist influences succeeded in arranging for reports of the Gaither Committee and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund Study Group, both made up mostly of entirely loyal Americans, to come out with such beautiful timing and terrifying hints to reinforce the impact of Sputnik on the American consciousness. But I can tell you exactly what the Kremlin has expected to accomplish by all of this concerted ballyhoo. For years we have been taken steadily down the road to communism by steps supposedly designed and presented to the American people as ways of fighting communism. The whole foreign aid program is an excellent example. Our foreign aid has done some good, of course. The communists do not believe in using solid black instrumentalities, but dark gray ones. They are always willing to be hurt or to take a loss for the sake of an ultimate net gain in any transaction. And American foreign aid, from the time it began as a contribution of some 72% of UNRWA funds, until it has reached the mammoth proportions of today, has been a tremendous help to the advance of communism. It was planned by the communists for that purpose. This pouring of American billions into foreign countries to make things easier for the communists and their socialist allies or agents is exactly what the communists wanted the American government to do. But they have not taken over so much of the world so largely by cunning, without that cunning being brilliant and professional. The one surest way in which foreign aid could be ballyhooed successfully and made permanently acceptable to the American taxpayer was to present it as a means of opposing communism. Now we see exactly the same principle at work on the whole front of our domestic economy. Although our danger remains almost entirely internal, from communist influences right in our midst and treason right in our government, the American people are being persuaded that our danger is from the outside, is from Russian military superiority. And under the excuse of preparing to match that military might, of defending ourselves from this threat of outside force, in other words, under the guise of fighting communism, we are being stampeded into the biggest jump ever towards, and perhaps the final jump right into, socialism and then the communist camp. Of course, Sputnik did many things for the Soviets. It gave them, no matter how undeserved, a whole new level of prestige in the scientific world. It put very valuable ammunition into the hands of the worldwide communist-sponsored groups, which in the United States were called Committees for a Sane Nuclear Policy, and into the hands of all the Cyrus Edens and Bertrand Russells and other, quote, let's surrender, unquote, boys. And it indirectly enabled the pro-communists in the chancelleries of Western Europe to increase their pressures on Adenauer in many ways. But we are talking at this point about the usefulness of Sputnik to the communists and their socialist allies through its impact on the psychology of the American people with regard to their domestic affairs. This, in my opinion, was the most important ultimate effect of Sputnik, as planned by the Soviets and is now gradually being realized by them. Here are the communists' aims for the United States, to be achieved, they hope, through the leftward momentum of the attitude induced by Sputnik and all of its auxiliary propaganda. 1. Greatly expand government spending for missiles, for so-called defense generally, for foreign aid, for every conceivable means of getting rid of ever larger sums of American money as wastefully as possible. 2. Higher and then much higher taxes. 3. An increasingly unbalanced budget despite the higher taxes. When these notes were first put together many months ago, I expected a deficit of $10 billion at least in the fiscal year of 1958-1959, despite all of the talk at that time about a balanced budget. Today, well-informed people, even within our government, are talking about a deficit of $15 billion. 4. Wild inflation of our currency leading rapidly towards its ultimate repudiation. 5. Government controls of prices, wages, and materials supposedly to combat inflation. 6. Greatly increased socialistic controls over every operation of our economy and every activity of our daily lives. This is to be accompanied, naturally and automatically, by a correspondingly huge increase in the size of our bureaucracy and in both the cost and reach of our domestic government. 7. Far more centralization of power in Washington and the practical elimination of our state lines. There is a many-faceted drive at work to have our state lines eventually mean no more within the nation than our county lines do now within the states. 8. The steady advance of federal aid to and control over our educational system, leading to complete federalization of our public education. 9. A constant hammering into the American consciousness of the horror of, quote, modern warfare, unquote, the beauties and the absolute necessity of, quote, peace, unquote, peace always on communist terms, of course. And 10. The consequent willingness of the American people to allow the steps of appeasement by our government, which amount to a piecemeal surrender of the rest of the free world and of the United States itself to the Kremlin-ruled tyranny. There is what Sputnik and all of its side decorations are really about. If the communists can succeed in making us domestically a communized nation, it will not be too difficult a final move for them to pull us right into the worldwide communist organization ruled by the Kremlin. And unless we can have enough of an awakening in this country, and enough of a rebellion against the appeasement policies of our government outside and its communizing policies inside America, the communists are going to succeed in accomplishing every one of these means to their final end, and that final goal as well. In summary, gentlemen, we are losing, rapidly losing, a Cold War in which our freedom, our country, and our very existence are at stake. And while we don't seem to know we are losing this war, you can be sure the communists do. There is just one thing, only one thing in the whole world, which the communists fear today. It is that despite their tremendous influence in our government and over all of our means of mass communication, the American people will wake up too soon to what has really been happening and what is now happening right under their very noses. The only thing which can possibly stop the communists is for the American people to learn the truth in time. It is to contribute my small bit to such an awakening that I have given up most of my business responsibilities and most of my income in order through my magazine and speeches to bring some inkling of the truth to as many people as I can reach. I do not expect nor deserve any slightest applause or sympathy for this sacrifice. I mention it at all for just one reason only, which is to show how deadly serious the situation appears to me. You may think I am an alarmist. Frankly, I am. For in my opinion, based on many years of intensive study of the methods, the progress, and the menace of the communist conspiracy, there is ample reason for extreme alarm, and I hope to make you alarmists too. It seems to me that all you need to cause you to share my alarm, my fears, and my determination is simply to get a map of the world and look at the score. And the first thing for you to do, as a newly awakened alarmist, is to become better informed about many things that we cannot cover here. One matter on which most Americans need to become better informed is what being subjugated by the communists, or, quote, arriving at an accommodation with communism, unquote, as they want it called, would really mean. For their cruelty and terrorism is almost beyond imagination, and the domination of our press, television, and radio by communist influences is now so great that you simply are not allowed to learn or be reminded of the real nature of the beasts to whom we are losing. General Mark Clark, for instance, officially reported from Korea, quote, "We obtained solid evidence that the communists slaughtered 11,622 members of my UN command while they were defenseless prisoners of war. These men were tied to their fellow prisoners and transported to previously selected sites. They were dumped alive into trenches dug for the purpose and summarily shot," unquote. About 5,000 of those boys were from your hometowns and mine. But how many of you ever saw that report in your headlines or anywhere else? During the so-called Spanish Civil War, the London Times, which then as now certainly was not slanted in favor of the anti-communists, reported that in one 12-month period the communists had murdered over 4,000 priests in cold blood, and had driven more than that many nuns out into the streets of various Spanish cities, inflicted horrible obscenities on them, and then murdered the nuns. In some places the communists herded priests and their congregations into churches, set the churches on fire, and burned the Christians and their buildings together. These and similar epic cruelties of the period are facts documented beyond all question, but how many of you have ever heard of them? The man right now, today, holding the highest theoretical honor and office in the Soviet Union is Clemente Voroshilov, chairman of the Presidium and generally accorded the exalted, if non-existent, title of President of the Soviet Union. When 11,000 Tsarist officers, with their wives and children, surrendered the city of Kiev on the solemn promise, a promise advanced to them by Voroshilov to induce this surrender, that they would be allowed to disperse and go to their homes, Voroshilov had all of the men and boys shot at once and put the women and girls into brothels for his army. Far from ever repenting of this supreme piece of barbarism, 15 years later Voroshilov boasted of it to American Ambassador William C. Bullitt as one of the glorious highlights of his career. And he explained that, with regard to using the women for his, quote, army's health, unquote, instead of shooting them, it didn't really matter because they were all dead within 3 months anyway. The record of Nikita Khrushchev is infinitely worse. mass murders totaling some 12 million victims can be charged directly to his orders. Bulganin, Menshikov, and the others are exactly the same. I could go on with specific and horrible illustrations literally for hours. Nor has there been any slightest change in communist methods or terrorism. Right now, the Algerian communist rebels, called the FLN, are perpetrating massive and incredible cruelties on their fellow Muslims in Algeria in order to terrorize those natives into appearing to support this communist-led guerrilla insurrection and making it look like a civil war. Exactly as the Chinese communists were performing mass tortures on the Chinese peasants for the same purpose a quarter of a century ago. Right now, Sukarno's communist goons, known as the Subsi, are murdering in cold blood the Christianized natives of the Moluccan Islands just as ruthlessly as Stalin's troops murdered native Spaniards in 1935. Right now, a communist named Fidel Castro is trying to frighten off all opposition to himself in Cuba by murders, burnings, and brutalities as cruel as any that the Russian communists imposed on eastern Poland in 1940 or on East Germany in 1945. And exactly the same thing is going on in many other parts of the world. All of this vicious and purposeful savagery I have been trying so inadequately even to indicate is not something happening on some other and far-off planet or perpetrated by the Assyrians 2,500 years ago or dreamed up as the imaginative nightmare of an Edgar Allan Poe. These, gentlemen, are the very real acts and deliberate policies of the recent past and the very present, of people whom we treat as human beings, and with whom we sit around conference tables and arrive at truce terms and concessions to appease them. There are some 700 million non-Russian, non-communists now living daily lives of virtual slavery behind the Iron Curtain, some 40 million of them in the actual slave labor camps of Russia and Red China, who only a dozen years ago, or much less, enjoyed practically the same personal freedoms as do you and I today. These people now say to each other, but above all to themselves, quote, "If I had only known, if I had only believed, there is no amount of work and sacrifice and suffering I would not have given if I had only realized the necessity, the danger in time. Now it is too late, and any amount of struggle and of sacrifice, even of life itself, is all in vain." Unquote. The number of people subject to these cruelties is now increasing by tens of millions every year, and we are directly in the path of the conqueror. Are we really so hopelessly blind, so stupefied by prosperity on one side and insidious propaganda on the other, that we cannot even see the wolves devouring the carcasses of our brothers or drawing ever nearer to ourselves? Are we going to let our country and our whole civilization go under and new dark ages of serfdom be ushered in while we happily play at our little games? May God forbid, but may we speedily become more worthy that he should. In fact, I wish to end this grim argument today on quite a religious note. For whether you believe it or not, we are far along in a gathering crisis that is going to make us all search deeply into our beliefs and into the values and loyalties that motivate our actions. This is a worldwide battle, the first in history, between light and darkness, between freedom and slavery, between the spirit of Christianity and the spirit of Antichrist for the souls and bodies of men. Let's win that battle by alertness, by determination, by courage, by an energizing realization of the danger, if we can. But let's win it even with our lives if the time comes when we must. Let's even keep in mind against that time an inspiration which we hope we shall not need. It comes from the end of a great and stirring hymn, written to inspire men to fight against a far less extensive slavery of their fellow men. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on.